The cold wind whipped across Hannah Keller's face as she huddled beneath the splintered floorboards of the abandoned general store. Her breath caught painfully in her throat at the sound of boots stomping overhead. For 7 months, she hadn't uttered more than necessary whispers, the silence becoming both her prison and protection since the Blackwell gang had murdered her father and claimed her voice as payment for her life. Montana Territory, 1878. The small mining town of Silver Creek had once been Hannah's home, filled with her father's laughter and plans for their modest ranch. Now it was a ghost of that place, overtaken by outlaws who discovered silver in the nearby hills and decided to claim the town as their headquarters. Hannah had survived by becoming invisible cleaning at the saloon, keeping her head down, and most importantly, keeping silent about what she'd witnessed the night her father was killed. The floor creaked above, and Hannah pressed herself tighter against the dirt wall of her hiding spot. The space beneath the store had become her sanctuary when the saloon closed and the Blackwell boys grew too drunk and dangerous. She'd accidentally discovered it while fleeing from one of the gang members 3 months ago, and its existence remained her most guarded secret. "Where's that mute girl?" the gruff voice of Jasper Blackwell carried through the floorboards. "Haven't seen her since she cleaned up after the poker game." "Probably skulking around somewhere," another voice answered. "Not like she's got anywhere to run to. Besides, she ain't worth the trouble. Can't even scream, much less talk." Hannah closed her eyes, pressing a dirt-stained hand to her mouth. She could talk, that was the terrible irony. But Jasper had made it clear the night he shot her father. "You say a word about what happened here to anyone, girl, and you'll join him. Keep your mouth shut if you want to live." So she had. For 7 long months she'd pretended to be mute, communicating only through nods and gestures. The deception had kept her alive but imprisoned her more effectively than any cell could have. The saloon owner, Mrs. Peterson, believed Hannah had been struck mute by the trauma of her father's death. The woman wasn't entirely wrong. The footsteps eventually moved away, and Hannah released her breath slowly. Dawn would come soon, and with it her shift at the saloon. She needed what little rest she could get. Curling onto her side, she used her shawl as a pillow, thinking of her father's voice, singing her to sleep when she was a child. Those memories were all she had left. The next morning arrived with the clatter of wagon wheels and unfamiliar voices in the street. Hannah slipped from her hiding place and hurried toward the back entrance of the saloon, keeping to the shadows. As she rounded the corner, she collided with a solid mass that sent her stumbling backward. "Whoa there," came a deep voice as strong hands steadied her shoulders. Hannah's gaze shot upward to meet eyes the color of summer sky. A man she'd never seen before stood before her, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he studied her face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a strong jawline shadowed by stubble. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the badge pinned to his vest caught the morning light. "You all right, miss?" he asked. Hannah nodded quickly, pulling away from his touch and dropping her gaze to the ground. A U.S. Marshal in Silver Creek could only mean trouble for everyone, including her. She tried to step around him, but he shifted, blocking her path. "Name's Thomas Nordstrom," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Just arrived in town. Would appreciate knowing yours." Hannah gestured helplessly to her throat and shook her head, the practiced motion one she'd performed countless times. "She don't talk," came Mrs. Peterson's voice as she emerged from the saloon's back door. The older woman wiped her hands on her apron and gave the marshal an appraising look. "Hannah works for me. Been mute since her pa was killed in a robbery gone bad. You the law they finally sent?" "Yes, madam," Marshal Nordstrom replied, though his eyes remained on Hannah. "Hear about the Blackwell gang. Got word they've been operating out of Silver Creek for some time now." Hannah felt her heart stutter. Jasper and his men had connections in the territorial government. How else had they operated so openly for so long? Every time lawmen had come through before, they'd left quickly, sometimes with suspicious bulges in their pockets. She didn't trust this one would be any different. "Well, you're a sight for sore eyes," Mrs. Peterson said, though I'd be careful about announcing that too loudly. "Hannah, get inside and start on those glasses from last night." Hannah nodded and slipped past the marshal, feeling his gaze follow her as she disappeared into the dim interior of the saloon. Throughout the day, as she scrubbed tables and washed glasses, she caught glimpses of the marshal moving through town, talking to shopkeepers and watching the comings and goings at the saloon. Jasper and his main crew were out at their mining claim, but they'd be back by sundown. Hannah's stomach twisted at the thought of what might happen then. By late afternoon, the first of the Blackwell boys had returned, and word of the marshal's presence spread quickly. Hannah worked faster, knowing the night would likely bring trouble. As she carried a tray of clean glasses to the bar, she felt someone watching her. Marshal Nordstrom sat at a corner table, nursing a coffee as his eyes tracked every person who entered. When their gazes met, Hannah quickly looked away, but not before noticing the thoughtful furrow of his brow. Something about the way he looked at her made her uncomfortable, not in the way Jasper's men did, with their leering grins and grabbing hands, but as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. Later, as the saloon filled with miners and the first of Jasper's crew, Hannah kept to the shadows, collecting dirty glasses and wiping down empty tables. She was reaching for an abandoned whiskey glass when a rough hand grabbed her wrist. "Well, if it ain't the mute mouse," drawled Eli, one of Jasper's more vicious lieutenants. "Heard there's a lawman in town. You been talking to him, girl?" Hannah shook her head frantically, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened painfully. "Better not be," he hissed, his whiskey-soured breath hot against her face. "Remember what happens to little mice that squeak." "The lady seems uncomfortable with your attention," came a steady voice from behind them. Eli turned, his hand still locked around Hannah's wrist, to face Marshal Nordstrom. The lawman stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, relaxed but alert. "This ain't your business, Marshal," Eli said, though he released Hannah's wrist. "Just having a friendly chat with our mute girl." "Didn't look friendly to me," Nordstrom replied, his eyes flicking briefly to Hannah. "Miss, are you all right?" Hannah nodded quickly, rubbing her wrist and taking a step back. "See?" Eli smirked. "She's fine. Now why don't you go back to your coffee and leave the local matters to locals?" The air in the saloon had grown thick with tension. Several other members of Jasper's gang had shifted in their seats, hands moving closer to their weapons. Hannah's heart hammered in her chest. If shooting started, innocent people would die. To her relief, Marshal Nordstrom gave a slight nod. "Just making sure," he said, then turned to Hannah. "If you need anything, miss, you let me know." The words seemed ordinary enough, but something in his tone, a gentleness, an invitation, made Hannah's breath catch. For a fleeting moment she was tempted to speak, to tell this stranger everything she knew. But Eli's watchful glare reminded her of the danger, and she simply nodded before hurrying back to the kitchen. The night grew rowdier as more of Jasper's men filtered in, celebrating a rich new vein they'd struck in the mine. Hannah worked frantically, trying to stay out of their way while keeping up with the demands for drinks and food. She was returning from the storeroom with a fresh bottle of whiskey when she nearly collided with Jasper himself. "There's our little mute," he said, blocking her path. His smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "Been hearing about you and the new marshal getting friendly." Hannah shook her head, clutching the bottle to her chest. "Good," Jasper said, lowering his voice, "because I'd hate to have to remind you of our agreement." His hand moved to his gun belt, a casual gesture that made Hannah flinch. "You keep quiet about that night, and I let you keep breathing. Simple as that." Hannah nodded, her eyes downcast. "Smart girl," Jasper said, plucking the whiskey from her hands. "Now get back to work, and stay away from that marshal." She scurried past him, relief flooding through her as she escaped to the relative safety of the kitchen. But as she pushed through the swinging door, a hand caught her elbow, pulling her into the shadows beside the large wood stove. "Don't scream," Marshal Nordstrom whispered, releasing her arm immediately when she turned to face him. "I just need a word with you." Hannah stared at him wide-eyed, her heart racing. "I've been watching," he continued, his voice low and urgent. "The way they treat you, the way you move always aware, always watching the exits. That's not just being cautious. That's survival." His eyes searched her face. "You're not really mute, are you?" Hannah's breath caught in her throat. How had he seen through her so quickly? She took a step back, shaking her head in denial. "It's all right," he said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to force you to talk. But I need to know what's really going on in this town. Jasper Blackwell and his men aren't just miners. They've robbed 3 stagecoaches in the last year, killed at least 7 people that we know of." Hannah remained frozen, torn between the instinct to flee and the desperate longing to finally tell someone the truth. "Whatever hold they have on you," the marshal continued, his voice softening, "I can help. But I need to know what I'm dealing with." He took a careful step closer. "You can talk here. It's safe." Those simple words, "you can talk here," broke something inside her. After months of enforced silence, of carrying the weight of what she'd witnessed alone, the gentle offer of safety was almost more than she could bear. Tears welled in her eyes, and her lips trembled with the effort to hold back words that threatened to spill forth. A crash from the saloon jolted her back to reality. Someone was calling for more whiskey. Hannah shook her head vehemently, pressing her finger to her lips before hurrying back out to the main room. Throughout the rest of the evening, she could feel Marshal Nordstrom's eyes following her. Each time she glanced his way, he was watching not with suspicion, but with a steady patience that unnerved her more than Jasper's threats. It was as if he was waiting for her to make a decision. By the time the saloon began to empty, Hannah was exhausted, her nerves frayed from navigating between Jasper's watchful gaze and the marshal's quiet observation. Mrs. Peterson, noticing her fatigue, sent her upstairs to the small room behind the kitchen where she sometimes slept when it was too dangerous to go to her hiding place. Hannah climbed the narrow stairs, muscles aching from the long day. The room was little more than a closet with a cot, but it offered privacy she rarely enjoyed. Closing the door behind her, she sank onto the thin mattress and finally allowed herself to cry silent tears born of fear and the crushing weight of her isolation. She didn't know how long she sat there before a soft knock at the door made her freeze. Wiping her face quickly, she moved to the door, opening it just a crack. Marshal Nordstrom stood in the dim hallway, his expression grave. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "Just for a moment. It's important." Hannah hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him to enter the tiny room. He removed his hat as he ducked through the doorway, revealing tousled dark hair. In the close confines of the room, Hannah was acutely aware of his height and breadth, yet, strangely, she felt no fear. "I apologize for disturbing you," he said, keeping his voice low, "but I received a telegram today that I think you should know about." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "There was another murder 2 towns over, a witness to one of the Blackwell robberies who'd been in protective custody. Someone got to him." Hannah's blood ran cold. She took an involuntary step back. "I think you're a witness too," the marshal continued, his blue eyes intent on her face. "And I think you're in danger as long as you stay here." She shook her head, backing away until she hit the wall. "Listen to me," he urged, taking a careful step closer. "I can protect you, get you somewhere safe, but we'd need to leave tonight while most of Jasper's men are too drunk to notice." Hannah's mind raced. Leave? The thought had occurred to her countless times over the past months, but where would she go? How would she survive? And if Jasper found her? As if reading her thoughts, Marshal Nordstrom added softly, "I know you're scared, but staying here, living like this, that's not surviving. That's just waiting to die." The harsh truth of his words struck her like a physical blow. She'd been telling herself she was surviving, but in reality, she was merely postponing her fate. Sooner or later, Jasper would tire of the risk she posed, or she would make a mistake. Still, she couldn't bring herself to speak. 7 months of silence had become a habit, a shield. "You don't have to talk," the marshal said, his voice gentle. "Not yet. Just nod if you want my help." Hannah stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. All she found was steady resolve. And something else? Compassion, perhaps. Or understanding. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Relief crossed his features. "Good," he said. "Pack whatever you need. Meet me behind the livery in 1 hour. I'll have horses ready." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I promise you, Hannah," he said, using her name for the first time, "I won't let them hurt you again." After he left, Hannah stood motionless for several minutes, trembling with the enormity of what she'd agreed to do. Then, with quick, decisive movements, she began gathering her few possessions: a change of clothes, a hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, the small knife she kept hidden in her boot. Everything fit easily into a worn cloth sack. Before leaving, she scrawled a brief note to Mrs. Peterson, thanking her for her kindness. She couldn't explain, but she couldn't simply disappear without acknowledgement either. The town was quiet as Hannah slipped through the back streets toward the livery. Most of the saloons had closed, and only a few lamps still burned in upper windows. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forests. Hannah moved silently, years of hunting with her father having taught her how to avoid twigs and loose stones. Marshal Nordstrom was waiting as promised, holding the reins of 2 saddled horses. He nodded approvingly at her quiet approach. "You move like a ghost," he whispered. "That's good. We'll head north through the pass, then east toward Fort Collins. I have friends there who can help us." Hannah took the reins of the smaller horse, a dappled mare with gentle eyes. As she prepared to mount, a voice called from the shadows. "Going somewhere, Mouse?" Hannah's heart stopped as Eli stepped from behind the livery, a pistol in his hand, his eyes, gleaming with malicious triumph, fixed on her face. "Jasper said you might try something stupid," he drawled, the gun aimed steadily at her chest. "Said I should keep an eye on you. Good thing I did." "Put the gun down, Eli," Marshal Nordstrom said calmly, positioning himself slightly in front of Hannah. "This doesn't have to end badly." "Oh, but it does," Eli replied with a nasty grin. "See, Jasper's got big plans, and they don't include some federal lawman poking around, or a little mouse who's seen too much." Everything happened in a blur. Eli's finger tightened on the trigger just as Marshal Nordstrom lunged forward. The gunshot cracked through the night, and Hannah screamed an actual sound, tearing from her throat after months of silence. Eli's eyes widened in shock, both at her voice and at the sight of Marshal Nordstrom still standing. The lawman's shoulder was bleeding, but his own gun was now drawn and steady. "Next move's yours," Nordstrom said, his voice hard. "But think carefully." Eli's gaze darted between them, calculation replacing surprise. "So the mute can speak after all," he said. "Jasper will be real interested in that." "Jasper won't hear about it," Nordstrom replied. "Drop your weapon, Eli, now." For a moment, Hannah thought Eli would comply. His gun hand lowered slightly. Then, with a sudden movement, he swung the weapon back up. Another shot rang out, and Eli crumpled to the ground. Hannah stood frozen, staring at the fallen man. Marshal Nordstrom holstered his weapon and quickly checked Eli's pulse. "He's alive," he said grimly, "but the whole town will have heard those shots. We need to move." He helped Hannah onto her horse, then mounted his own, grimacing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "Can you ride?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper after so long unused. Surprise flickered across his face at the sound of her voice, quickly replaced by determination. "Yes, let's go." They rode hard through the night, following game trails that wound up into the mountains. The full moon provided enough light to navigate by, and Marshal Nordstrom seemed familiar with the terrain. Hannah's mind raced with fear and an odd sense of exhilaration. She'd spoken. After 7 months of silence, she'd broken her vow. And she was alive. Several hours later, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they stopped in a small clearing beside a creek. The marshal dismounted stiffly, his face pale with pain. "We need to tend to your wound," Hannah said, her voice still rough and uncertain. "So you really can talk," he replied with a weak smile, leaning against a tree. "I wasn't entirely sure." Hannah helped him remove his coat and shirt, revealing a bloody gash where the bullet had grazed his shoulder. Using water from the creek and strips torn from her spare petticoat, she cleaned and bound the wound as best she could. "Thank you," he said when she'd finished. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "My father," she answered, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "He was a doctor before we came west." Marshal Nordstrom nodded, studying her face. "Why did they think you were mute?" Hannah looked away, focusing on washing the blood from her hands in the creek. "Jasper Blackwell killed my father," she said finally, the words rushing out after being contained for so long. "I saw him do it. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd kill me too. Said I should keep my mouth shut if I wanted to live." She gave a bitter laugh. "So I did. Completely. Pretended I couldn't speak at all. It was easier than trying to talk without saying the wrong thing." "That's why you survived when the other witnesses didn't," the marshal said softly. "They didn't know you were a threat." Hannah nodded. "But they never fully trusted me either. I was always watched." "You're incredibly brave," he said, the admiration in his voice making her look up in surprise. "Most people wouldn't have had the strength to maintain that kind of deception." "It wasn't bravery," she replied. "It was fear." "Sometimes they're the same thing," he said, "doing what needs to be done despite being afraid." They rested for a few hours, taking turns keeping watch. Hannah found it strange and wonderful to speak again, though she used words sparingly, as if testing their weight after so long. By mid-morning, they were back on the trail, moving more cautiously now. Marshal Nordstrom explained that they were heading for a small hunting cabin he knew of, where they could rest properly before continuing to Fort Collins. "How did you know?" Hannah asked as they rode side by side along a narrow ridge. "That I could speak, I mean." He glanced at her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Little things. The way you reacted when people spoke to you, not with confusion, but with understanding. The way you sometimes mouthed words when you thought no one was looking." He smiled slightly. "And your eyes. They said plenty, even when your voice didn't." Hannah felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "I was careful." "You were," he agreed, "but I've spent years reading people. It's part of the job." They reached the cabin by late afternoon. It was a simple one-room structure, sturdy but basic, with a stone fireplace and single window. Marshal Nordstrom checked the interior carefully before declaring it safe. "No one's been here in months," he said, brushing dust from a rough wooden table. "We can rest here tonight, continue tomorrow." Hannah helped him gather firewood and clean the cabin as best they could. As she worked, she found herself watching the marshal, the careful precision of his movements despite his injury, the quiet competence with which he approached each task. He was unlike any man she'd encountered in Silver Creek. As darkness fell, and they sat before the fire, sharing a simple meal of jerky and biscuits from their provisions, Hannah finally asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "What happens now? To me, I mean." Marshal Nordstrom set down his tin cup. "You're the key witness against Jasper Blackwell," he said. "With your testimony, we can bring him and his entire operation down. After what happened with Eli, they'll be looking for both of us now. Once we reach Fort Collins, I can arrange for your protection until the trial." "And after?" Hannah pressed. "What happens to me after the trial?" He studied her across the firelight. "That would be up to you. You'd be free to go wherever you wanted. Start fresh." Hannah stared into the flames, trying to imagine such a future. After months of living day to day, focusing only on survival, the concept of planning beyond the immediate dangers seemed foreign. "I don't know where I'd go," she admitted softly. "My father was all the family I had." "You don't have to decide now," he said gently. "One step at a time." They fell silent, the crackling of the fire filling the small cabin. Outside, an owl called, its lonely cry echoing through the trees. "You should get some rest," Marshal Nordstrom said eventually, rising to check the door was secure. "I'll take first watch." "Your shoulder," Hannah began. "Is fine," he interrupted with a small smile. "I've had worse. Sleep. You've had a long day." Hannah wanted to argue but found herself too exhausted to resist. Using her sack as a pillow and her shawl as a blanket, she settled onto the cabin's single cot while the marshal positioned himself near the window. Despite her fatigue, sleep proved elusive. Every sound, the wind in the trees, the settling of the cabin's timbers made her tense, expecting Jasper or his men to appear. And beneath that fear lay another kind of tension, an acute awareness of Marshal Nordstrom's presence across the small room. "Thomas," she said finally, his first name feeling intimate in the darkness. "Yes?" His response came immediately, suggesting he hadn't been sleeping either. "Thank you. For believing me. For helping me." There was a moment of silence before he replied. "I should be thanking you. Your courage may help us stop a man who's hurt a lot of people." Hannah turned his words over in her mind. Courage. Was that what this was? It felt more like desperation. "Try to sleep," he said softly. "We still have a long journey ahead." Eventually, exhaustion overcame her anxiety, and Hannah drifted into an uneasy slumber filled with fragmented dreams. Her father's smile, Jasper's cold eyes, the sound of gunfire, and through it all, a steady voice saying, "You can talk here." She woke to the smell of coffee and the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the cabin's single window. Marshal Nordstrom Thomas, she corrected herself mentally, was stoking the fire. His movements careful but less stiff than the previous day. "Morning," he said, noticing her stirring. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Hannah admitted, sitting up and combing her fingers through her tangled hair. It wasn't entirely a lie despite the nightmares. She'd slept without the constant fear of discovery that had plagued her in Silver Creek. "Good. We should eat and get moving. I'd like to put more distance between us and any pursuit before midday." As they shared a breakfast of the last of their provisions, Thomas spread out a worn map on the table between them. "We're here," he said, pointing to a spot in the mountains. "Fort Collins is about 2 days' ride east. We'll need to stop in the settlement," he indicated a tiny marking on the map, "to resupply and send a telegram to my superiors about what's happened." "Is it safe?" Hannah asked, studying the unfamiliar names on the map. "Won't Jasper have men looking for us?" "Possibly," Thomas acknowledged, "but Jasper's influence doesn't extend much beyond Silver Creek in the immediate territory, and we have the advantage of knowing they're after us while they don't know where we're headed." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, following a deer trail that wound down through stands of pine and aspen. The day was clear, the sky a brilliant blue that reminded Hannah of Thomas's eyes. She found herself watching him as he rode ahead, noting the straight set of his shoulders and the alertness with which he surveyed their surroundings. "How long have you been a marshal?" she asked as they paused to water the horses at a small stream. 5 years, he replied, filling their canteens. "Before that, I was a sheriff in Kansas, and before that, I rode with the cavalry during the war." "You've seen a lot," Hannah observed. A shadow crossed his face. "Too much sometimes, but it's good work most days, helping people who can't help themselves." He glanced at her. "What about you? What did you do before all this?" Hannah considered the question. "I helped my father with his practice. He taught me about medicine, setting bones, treating fevers. When we came west 3 years ago, he was hoping to establish himself as the town doctor in Silver Creek." She smiled sadly. "He loved it there, before the Blackwells came. Said the mountain air was good for his lungs." "You miss him," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Every day," she admitted. "He was a good man, kind. He treated everyone the same, whether they could pay or not." Her throat tightened. He didn't deserve what happened to him. "Few victims do," Thomas said quietly. "That's why what you're doing matters. Your testimony can help ensure he didn't die for nothing." They continued their journey, the conversation shifting to lighter topics as they rode books they'd read, places they'd seen. Hannah found herself laughing for the first time in months at Thomas's dry observations about the peculiar characters he'd encountered in his work. The sound startled her, rusty and unfamiliar. By late afternoon, they reached the settlement Thomas had indicated on the map, little more than a cluster of buildings around a stagecoach stop. They approached cautiously, watching for any sign of Jasper's men, but the small community seemed peaceful, occupied mainly by farmers and a few prospectors. Thomas arranged for rooms at the settlement's modest boarding house while Hannah waited with the horses, her hat pulled low over her face. Once they were settled, he left to send his telegram and purchase supplies, instructing Hannah to remain in her room with the door locked. Alone for the first time since their escape, Hannah found herself pacing the small room, alternating between relief at their progress and gnawing worry about what lay ahead. The trial would mean facing Jasper again, describing in detail what she'd witnessed. The thought made her stomach clench with fear. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Hannah." "It's me," came Thomas's voice. She opened the door to find him holding a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I brought some things," he said, entering the room and closing the door behind him. "Supplies for the journey and—" He hesitated, then handed her the bundle. "Some new clothes. I thought you might want something different." Hannah unwrapped the package to find a simple but well-made dress of deep blue cotton, along with a clean shirtwaist and practical boots. "I had to guess at the size," Thomas said, a faint flush coloring his cheekbones. "The shopkeeper's wife helped." "Thank you," Hannah said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. After months of wearing the same two dresses, rotating them for washing, the new clothing felt like an extravagant gift. "There's a bathhouse behind the boarding house," he continued. "I've arranged for you to have privacy there if you'd like." An hour later, scrubbed clean and dressed in her new clothes, Hannah felt transformed. She'd washed and dried her long brown hair, letting it hang loose down her back instead of in its usual severe braid. The dress fit surprisingly well, the color bringing out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. When she returned to her room, she found Thomas waiting with dinner, a simple but hearty meal of stew, bread, and even a slice of apple pie. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "You look," he began, then cleared his throat. "Better, rested." "I feel better," she admitted, settling across from him at the small table. "Almost like myself again." As they ate, Thomas shared what he'd learned in the settlement. "No sign of pursuit yet," he said, "but I don't want to linger. We'll leave at first light." "Did your telegram go through?" He nodded. "We'll have an escort waiting for us outside Fort Collins. You'll be safe there." The word "safe" hung between them, a promise Hannah hardly dared believe in after so long. "What about you?" she asked suddenly. "After we reach Fort Collins?" Thomas paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "I'll need to organize the case against Jasper, gather additional witnesses if possible. There are rumors he has connections in the territorial government, bribes, blackmail. I need to uncover that as well." "You're going back to Silver Creek," Hannah realized, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. "Eventually, yes," he acknowledged, "but not until you're secure and the necessary warrants are issued." Hannah pushed her plate away, her appetite suddenly gone. The thought of Thomas riding back into danger made her chest tight with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. "It's my job, Hannah," he said gently, reading her expression. "And it's not just about Jasper anymore. After what happened with Eli, this is personal." "That's what worries me," she replied. "Jasper doesn't lose, not when it matters to him." "He hasn't faced me before," Thomas said, a hard edge entering his voice. "Or you. Your testimony is the key, Hannah. With it, we can bring him down permanently." Later, as they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Hannah found herself reluctant to part company. The hours of conversation had awakened something in her that had been dormant since her father's death, a sense of connection, of being seen and understood. "Thomas," she said as he turned to leave. She faltered, unsure how to express the tumult of emotions coursing through her. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Yes?" "Be careful," she said finally. "Tomorrow and after, when you go back." A soft smile touched his lips. "I will. Get some rest, Hannah. Tomorrow will be a long day." Despite her fears, Hannah slept deeply that night, exhaustion claiming her the moment her head touched the pillow. She woke to the first light of dawn and the sound of activity in the settlement. Dressing quickly in her new clothes, she gathered her few possessions and went to meet Thomas. They departed as planned, riding east as the sun rose behind them. The day was cooler than the previous one, with clouds building on the horizon that promised rain by evening. Thomas set a brisk pace, clearly anxious to reach their destination before the weather turned. They rode mostly in silence, both alert for any sign of pursuit. By mid-afternoon, the open country began to give way to scattered farms, an indication they were approaching more settled territory. "We'll stop at the next farm," Thomas decided as fat raindrops began to fall. "Ask if we can shelter in their barn until the storm passes." The rain intensified rapidly, soaking them before they reached the modest homestead Thomas had spotted. A weathered man with a gray beard answered their hail, eyeing them suspiciously before Thomas identified himself as a U.S. Marshal. "Storm's going to be a bad one," the farmer said, glancing at the darkening sky. "Barn's yours if you want it, but you're welcome to the house. Wife's made stew, and there's plenty." Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between courtesy and caution. "We'd be grateful for the hospitality," Hannah said, making the decision for him. After days on the trail, the prospect of a home-cooked meal and friendly company was too tempting to refuse. The farmer, who introduced himself as Joseph Miller, led them to a neat cabin where his wife Martha welcomed them warmly. Soon, Hannah was helping the older woman finish dinner preparations, while Thomas spoke with Joseph about conditions of the trail ahead. "You two been married long?" Martha asked as Hannah sliced bread at the kitchen table. Hannah nearly cut her finger in surprise. "Oh, we're not, that is. Marshal Nordstrom is escorting me to Fort Collins, official business." Martha raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "Well, married or not, it's nice to have company. Gets lonely out here sometimes." Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Joseph sharing stories of the early days of his homestead, and Martha insisting they both take seconds of her excellent stew. For a few hours, the danger that had shadowed them since leaving Silver Creek seemed distant and unreal. After the meal, as Joseph showed Thomas his collection of hand-carved pipes, Martha drew Hannah aside. "I don't mean to pry, dear," the older woman said kindly, "but I can see you've been through something difficult. My Joseph was a marshal himself years ago. I know that look the way you check the windows, start at sudden noises." Hannah hesitated, then decided a partial truth was safe enough. "I'm a witness in a case," she explained. "There are people who don't want me to testify." Martha nodded understanding. "Well, you've got a good man watching over you. I can tell that much." She patted Hannah's hand. "And whatever you're running from, remember it's behind you now, not ahead." The storm raged throughout the night, thunder rattling the cabin's windows and lightning illuminating the room where Hannah slept in brief, brilliant flashes. Despite the comfort of a real bed and Martha's assurances of safety, she found herself startling awake at each crash of thunder, reaching instinctively for the knife she kept under her pillow. During one such awakening, she heard low voices from the main room, Thomas and Joseph, still up despite the late hour. Curiosity drew her to the door, which had been left slightly ajar. "Dangerous man," Thomas was saying. "He's got half the county officials in his pocket, and those he can't buy he intimidates or eliminates." "Sounds like you've tangled with his kind before," came Joseph's rumbling reply. "Too many times," Thomas admitted, "but this one's personal. He's hurt too many innocent people, including Hannah." There was a pause, the silence filled only by the crackling of the fire and the drum of rain on the roof. "She's special to you," Joseph observed, his tone matter-of-fact. Another pause, longer this time. "Yes," Thomas finally said, so quietly Hannah had to strain to hear. "Though it's not my place to say so." "Why not?" Joseph asked. "Life's too short for hesitation, especially in your line of work." "She's been through hell," Thomas replied. "Lost her father, lived in fear for months. The last thing she needs is complications." "Seems to me," Joseph said thoughtfully, "that after all that darkness, a little light might be welcome. Not a complication at all." Hannah backed away from the door, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Thomas thought she was special. The knowledge warmed her in places that had been cold for too long. Morning brought clear skies, and the realization that they were only half a day's ride from Fort Collins. As they prepared to depart, Martha pressed a bundle of food into Hannah's hands, and Joseph gave Thomas detailed directions for the quickest route. "Thank you both," Hannah said sincerely, "for everything." Martha hugged her tightly. "You take care, child, and remember what I said. Look forward, not back." They rode steadily through the morning, the landscape gradually becoming more cultivated as they approached the outskirts of Fort Collins. Thomas explained that his telegram had arranged for a meeting point just outside town, where an escort would be waiting to take them to a safe location. "What will happen when we get there?" Hannah asked as they stopped to rest the horses beside a clear stream. "You'll be placed under protection," Thomas replied. "Comfortable lodgings, guards, the works. I'll take your formal statement, and we'll prepare for your testimony." "And you?" she pressed. "What will you do?" He avoided her gaze, focusing on adjusting his saddle. "Like I said, I'll need to gather more evidence, track down other potential witnesses." "In Silver Creek," Hannah said, a statement rather than a question. Thomas nodded. "Jasper needs to be stopped, Hannah. What happened to your father? To you, it can't happen to others." "I know," she said softly. "Just promise me you'll be careful." He looked at her then, his blue eyes serious. "I promise." They reached the meeting point, a crossroads marked by a solitary oak tree by mid-afternoon. As promised, two men were waiting, both wearing the unmistakable badges of U.S. Marshals. Thomas greeted them with evident relief. "Marshal Nordstrom," the older of the two men acknowledged. "We received your telegram. Everything's arranged as you requested." "Thank you, Marshal Cooper," Thomas replied, then turned to Hannah. "Hannah, this is Marshal Cooper and Marshal Daniels. They'll escort us the rest of the way." Hannah nodded in greeting, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. With the arrival of the other marshals, her time alone with Thomas was effectively over. The journey into Fort Collins passed in a blur. Hannah found herself riding between Marshal Daniels and Marshal Cooper, with Thomas leading the way. They bypassed the main streets of the town, taking back alleys to a sturdy two-story house set slightly apart from its neighbors. "This is one of our safe houses," Thomas explained as they dismounted. "You'll be comfortable here until the trial." The interior of the house was simple but clean, with solid furniture and thick curtains that could be drawn against prying eyes. Marshal Cooper showed Hannah to a bedroom on the second floor, while Thomas conferred with Marshal Daniels in the study. Left alone to settle in, Hannah unpacked her few possessions and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process the abrupt transition. After days on the trail with just Thomas for company, the house felt simultaneously too large and too confining. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Thomas entered, his expression somber. "The territorial judge will be here tomorrow to take your deposition," he said, remaining near the door. "After that, we'll start building the case against Jasper." Hannah nodded, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "When will you leave?" He met her eyes directly. "Tomorrow evening. The sooner I get back to Silver Creek, the better our chances of catching Jasper before he goes to ground." "I see," Hannah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with words neither seemed ready to speak. "You'll be safe here," Thomas finally said. "Cooper and Daniels are good men. They won't let anything happen to you." "I know," Hannah replied. "It's not me I'm worried about." Thomas took a step closer, then stopped, as if restraining himself. "Hannah, A call from downstairs interrupted whatever he'd been about to say. "Marshal Nordstrom, telegram for you." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I should see to that." "Yes," Hannah agreed, though everything in her wanted to ask him to stay, to finish what he'd been about to say. After he left, Hannah moved to the window, gazing out at the unfamiliar town that would be her home for the foreseeable future. The sun was setting, painting the buildings in shades of gold and amber. Beautiful, yet Hannah felt only a hollow ache in her chest. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair. Marshal Cooper outlined the security measures that would be in place during Hannah's stay, while Marshal Daniels discussed the legal process ahead. Thomas said little, his attention seemingly focused on the telegram he'd received earlier. After the meal, as the other marshals retired to discuss watch rotations, Thomas asked Hannah to join him on the small porch at the back of the house. "What was in the telegram?" Hannah asked once they were alone. "News from Silver Creek," he replied, his expression grim. "Jasper's gone on a rampage since our escape. 2 people who helped us, Mrs. Peterson and the livery owner, have been beaten. He's demanding information on our whereabouts." Hannah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Are they all right?" "Mrs. Peterson will recover. The livery owner," Thomas shook his head. It doesn't look good. Guilt crashed over Hannah like a physical wave. "This is my fault. If I hadn't agreed to leave—" "No," Thomas interrupted fiercely. "This is Jasper's doing, not yours. You can't blame yourself for his cruelty." "But if people are being hurt because of me, they're being hurt because Jasper Blackwell is a violent criminal who thinks he's above the law," Thomas said, taking her hands in his. "The only way to stop him is to testify against him, to help us put him away for good." Hannah looked down at their joined hands, drawing strength from his certainty. "I'm scared," she admitted, "not just of Jasper, but of what comes after. I don't know how to start over again." Thomas's fingers tightened around hers. "You won't have to do it alone," he said softly. Hannah looked up, searching his face. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I care for you, Hannah. More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances. When this is over, when Jasper is behind bars and you're truly free, I'd like to— that is, if you were willing." "Yes," Hannah said simply, her heart suddenly light in her chest. A smile broke across Thomas's face, transforming his serious features. "You don't even know what I was going to ask." "It doesn't matter," she replied, feeling bold in a way she hadn't in months. "The answer is yes." Thomas laughed, the sound warm and rich in the evening air. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, a question rather than a demand. Hannah answered by stepping closer, her hands moving to his shoulders as his arms encircled her waist. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I'll come back," he promised, "as soon as I can." "I know," Hannah said, and was surprised to realize she truly believed it. This man, who had seen past her silence to the truth beneath, who had risked his life to help her, he would keep his word. The morning brought the territorial judge, a stern-faced man named Henry Sullivan, who listened intently as Hannah recounted what she had witnessed the night her father was murdered. Thomas remained by her side throughout the deposition, his presence a silent source of strength. "Your testimony is compelling, Miss Keller," Judge Sullivan said when she had finished, "and it corresponds with evidence Marshal Nordstrom has already gathered regarding Jasper Blackwell's activities. I'm prepared to issue the necessary warrants immediately." Relief washed over Hannah. It was finally happening justice for her father, for herself, for all of Jasper's victims. The preparations for Thomas's departure were completed by early afternoon. As he checked his weapons and packed his saddlebags, Hannah found herself fighting the urge to beg him to stay. "I'll send word as soon as the warrants are served," he told her as they stood in the entrance hall. "It shouldn't take more than a week, maybe 2. Hannah nodded, forcing a smile. "I'll be here." Marshal Cooper tactfully busied himself with paperwork in the study, giving them a moment of privacy. "Hannah," Thomas said, his voice low, "last night, I didn't get to finish what I wanted to say." "You don't have to," she began, but he shook his head. "I do. Because I'm riding into danger, and if something happens, I want you to know." He took her hands in his blue eyes earnest. "I love you. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you in Silver Creek, trying so hard to be invisible while your eyes said everything you couldn't." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas." "You don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "It's too soon, I know that, but I needed you to know before I leave." Hannah reached up, touching his face gently. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "I love you too. How could I not? You gave me my voice back." The smile that lit his face was worth any risk, any uncertainty the future might hold. Their goodbye kiss was bittersweet, laden with promises and fears. Hannah stood on the porch watching until Thomas's figure disappeared down the road, Marshal Daniels riding beside him for the first leg of the journey. The days that followed settled into a strange routine. Hannah gave additional statements to prosecutors preparing the case, reviewed evidence, and identified members of Jasper's gang from photographs. In the evenings, she sat by the window of her room, watching the road for any sign of a returning rider. A week passed with no word from Thomas. Then, 2. Marshal Cooper assured her that such delays were common in complex cases, but Hannah could see the concern in his eyes that mirrored her own. On the 17th day since Thomas's departure, a messenger arrived at the safe house, bearing a telegram that Marshal Cooper read with a grim expression. "What is it?" Hannah asked, dread coiling in her stomach. "Is it Thomas? Has something happened?" Marshal Cooper hesitated, then handed her the telegram. "It's from Marshal Daniels. There was a confrontation in Silver Creek. Jasper Blackwell is dead, along with 3 of his men." Hannah scanned the message frantically, her heart stopping at the final line. Marshal Nordstrom wounded. Condition serious. Returning to Fort Collins with prisoner transport. "When?" she demanded. "When will they arrive?" "Tomorrow, if they travel through the night," Marshal Cooper replied. "Hannah, I know you're worried, but..." She wasn't listening, already racing upstairs to her room. There she paced, alternating between prayers and planning what she would need to care for Thomas properly when he arrived. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind filled with worst-case scenarios. By dawn, she was exhausted, but too anxious to rest, stationed by the front window watching for any sign of approaching riders. They came just after noon, a small procession of horses in a wagon rolling slowly up the road. Hannah was out the door before Marshal Cooper could stop her, running to meet them. The wagon contained 3 men in shackles, members of Jasper's gang who had been captured alive. But Hannah's attention was fixed on the rider at the head of the procession. Thomas sat tall in the saddle despite the bandage visible beneath his torn shirt, his face pale but determined. When he saw Hannah, a smile broke through his exhaustion. He dismounted carefully, wincing at the movement, and opened his arms just in time to catch her as she flung herself against his chest. "You're alive," she breathed, mindful of his wound but unwilling to let go. "You came back." "I promised I would," he replied, his voice rough with fatigue but warm with love. Later, after Thomas had been settled in a room and his wound properly tended, he told Hannah what had happened in Silver Creek. Jasper had been cornered at his mining claim, where evidence of both silver theft and counterfeiting had been discovered. "He wouldn't surrender," Thomas explained, propped up on pillows in the bed as Hannah sat beside him. "Started shooting. One of his bullets caught me in the side, but Marshal Daniels and the deputies we'd brought managed to return fire. Jasper was killed instantly." Hannah took his hand, her thumb stroking his palm. "It's over then? Really over?" Thomas nodded. "The remaining members of his gang have been arrested. The territorial governor has already assigned a new sheriff to Silver Creek, an honest man this time. And with Jasper's connections exposed, there's a major investigation underway into corruption in the territorial government." "And the people he hurt? Mrs. Peterson? The livery owner?" "Recovering," Thomas assured her. "Mrs. Peterson sends her regards, by the way. Says she always knew you were smarter than you let on." Hannah smiled at that, imagining the older woman's shrewd assessment. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate future. Thomas's expression softened. "Well, first, I need to recover. Then there will be paperwork mountains of it. Trials for the remaining gang members." He squeezed her hand. "But after that depends on you." "On me?" "I've been offered a position in Denver," he explained, supervising Marshal for the Eastern Territory. Less field work, more administration. A wry smile touched his lips. Apparently getting shot encourages one's superiors to suggest desk duties. You'd take it? Hannah asked, surprised. She'd always imagined Thomas in the field, pursuing justice with the same determination he'd shown in Silver Creek. I'm considering it, he admitted. It would mean staying in one place, having a home rather than riding from town to town. His eyes held hers. It would mean being able to offer a certain stability to someone I might want to build a life with. Hannah's heart quickened. That sounds nice, she said softly. It would be nicer if that someone agreed to marry me, Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. For a moment, Hannah couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotions too powerful for words. Then, remembering how he had once given her back her voice when silence had been her only safety, she found exactly what she wanted to say. Yes, she answered, leaning forward to seal the promise with a kiss. Yes, I'll marry you. 3 months later, Hannah stood beside Thomas on the steps of the small church in Denver, receiving congratulations from well-wishers. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, a gift from Martha Miller, who had traveled with Joseph to attend the ceremony. Told you to look forward, not back, Martha said with satisfaction as she hugged the bride. And look how well that turned out. Mrs. Peterson had come too, fully recovered from her injuries, and delighted to see Hannah finally using that voice of hers properly. Marshal Cooper and Marshal Daniels stood as witnesses, both men having become friends during the trials that followed Jasper's death. As the celebration continued around them, Thomas drew Hannah aside into the quiet of the church garden. "Happy?" he asked, his blue eyes bright with love. Hannah nodded, leaning into the strength of his embrace. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "because I plan to spend the rest of my life keeping you that way." Hannah smiled, remembering the terrified young woman who had hidden beneath floorboards and kept silent to survive. That silence had saved her life. But Thomas had saved her heart, giving her not just safety but the courage to speak, to love, to live fully again. "I love you, Thomas Nordstrom," she said, the words flowing freely now, no longer trapped behind fear. "And I love you, Hannah Nordstrom," he replied, the new name a promise of the future they would build together. As they rejoined their guests, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought her here from the darkness of Silver Creek to the light of this new beginning. She had tried to keep quiet to survive, but in finding her voice, she had found so much more: justice, healing, and a love worth speaking for.